Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit the Dottie pullover. So the first thing you'll need for this project is the free written pattern, which you can get by clicking the link in the description box below. That is the first link in the description box below. Or you can purchase the large print, ad-free, printable PDF version of the pattern in my shop by clicking the second link in the description box down below. So before you get whatever yarn you're going to use for your project, you're going to need to choose a size. So this pattern comes in 9 different sizes, from a women's extra small to a women's 5X. So you'll need to go by the bust measurement of the wearer to choose a size to knit, and that will determine how much yarn you're going to need. So for this project, I am using Lion Brand Color Made Easy, and this is a number 5 bulky weight yarn. Very soft, very squishy. It's 100% acrylic, and this is Millennial Pink, but they have a lot of other colorways of this yarn that are very pretty as well, or you can use pretty much any yarn that you want as long as it is labeled number 5 bulky weight. Now, I do not recommend substituting with any other yarn weight, meaning the thickness of the yarn. This little symbol right here denotes the thickness. This pattern is written for number 5 bulky yarn, and if you try to switch to a different kind of yarn, then it's going to totally throw off all of basically the entire pattern, and it will come out very wrong. So you want to make sure that you're using a number 5 bulky weight yarn, and then you can go by the pattern instructions and make sure that you have enough yarn, not in weight of how many balls you have or how much weight of yarn. You need to go by how many yards, because if you go by, oh, I have X number of balls of yarn, a lot of times different brands of yarn and different lines of yarn come in different size balls. So you want to go by the yardage and not by just how many balls. But if you are using the exact same line of yarn that I'm using, then it will tell you how many balls of this particular yarn that you'll need for the size you want to make. So there are also a few other things that I have here for this project. This right here is a US size 11 or 8mm circular knitting needle, and yes, it does need to be a circular knitting needle because we are knitting this sweater all in one piece in the round. So you'll definitely need your knitting needle to be a circular knitting needle. This one is about 32 inches long, and that's pretty much the minimum length. So if you're making one of the larger sizes, I'm going to be making the extra small, but if you're making one of the larger sizes, you can use a longer circular needle, but you don't want your needle to be too much longer than the circumference of the finished bust of the sweater. So I also have a measuring tape and some scissors and a yarn needle to weave in my ends. But one very important thing that you need for this project is some stitch markers. Now, if you don't have stitch markers, you can use like small loops of yarn with the ends tied together. But I prefer the plastic or, some kind of stitch marker that is hard instead of just being a loop of yarn. If you do choose to use a loop of yarn as your stitch marker, you need to make sure it is a different color than the yarn that you're using. So the most important thing here is that your stitch markers need to be able to sit on the needle like this, because we're going to be slipping the stitch markers. So they need to fit on your needle, and you'll need 4 that match for the increased lines on the raglan shaping. And then you'll need another one that does not look like the other 4 for the marker for the beginning and end of the round, because you don't want to confuse the beginning and end of the round with where you're shaping. And the shaping for this is not too difficult. It's just increasing, and we're just kind of increasing along a line to make the raglan sleeve shaping. So we're going to start from the neck ribbing and work our way down from there, so let's get started. Alright, so we're ready to start casting on for our sweater, and we're going to be casting on around the neck edge, and then we're slowly going to be increasing outward to make the upper part of the sweater where the neckline gradually gets bigger. The neckline stays the same size, but we start at the neckline, and the piece gradually gets bigger to make enough stitches for the armholes and for the body of the sweater. So I have my circular needle here and my yarn. And what we're going to do is begin with a long tail cast on. So I'm going to leave a tail. I've got a good yard of a tail here and make a slip knot. And then we're going to go ahead and pick up the needle and place the slip knot on the needle, and that counts as our first stitch. Then we're going to hold the yarn in the slingshot position where the working yarn is going over the index finger and then down through the rest of the hand. And the tail yarn is coming around behind the thumb and then down through the rest of the fingers of my hand. So for each stitch, I'm going to come over here, pick up the strand of yarn that's on the front of my thumb, reach over and grab the yarn from the index finger and pull it underneath the yarn from the thumb. Then I'm going to let go of the yarn with my thumb, and then I'm going to stick my thumb underneath the tail yarn and then bring it back out like this. So again, I'm going to insert my right needle underneath the yarn that's on the front of my thumb. Then I'm going to reach over and grab the yarn from my index finger and pull it underneath the yarn from the thumb, remove the thumb, and then pick up the yarn with the thumb again by putting the thumb in between the yarn and the index finger and then bringing it behind the yarn like that. So I'm going to keep casting on with this method, and you don't want to do it super tight. You want to do it kind of loosely so that it's not going to inhibit the stretch of the neckline too much. And what we're going to do is cast on in this manner until we have the correct number of stitches for whatever size you're making. So I'm making the extra small, and for the extra small I need to cast on a total of 64 stitches. So I'm going to keep going with my cast on until I have 64 stitches on my needle. Alright, so I've finished casting on all the stitches I need for the size that I'm making. Of course, it's probably going to be a different number for the size that you're making, so check the written pattern. But now that I've got all the stitches cast on, what we need to do is join to work in the round. And if you'll notice here, no matter which size you're making, your cast on for the neck edge is not going to be long enough to make it all the way around the length of your circular needle, and it shouldn't be, okay? Because this is the neckline, and the neckline is not supposed to be as big around as the bust or the armholes or etc., because the neckline is the smallest part of the body of the sweater. So what we're going to do to make this work for knitting in the round is we're going to use the magic loop method, and this is not a hard technique to do. All we're going to do is we're going to come over here about halfway-ish through our cast on, and we're going to reach in between some of the stitches and grab the cable on our circular needle, and we're going to pull on it until some of that length comes out. And as we do this, we're going to bring the other needle tip back down into our stitches. And now we have the equivalent of a shorter circular needle, even though it's the same circular needle, and this circular needle is long enough to allow us to continue working as our sweater piece gets larger. So instead of using a smaller needle now and then switching to a longer one later, we're using the same needle throughout the entire sweater and just using this magic loop method to get the excess length of the cable out of the way. And then that way we don't have to worry about changing needles just to get one that's shorter or longer. And when we get to the sleeves, this will also eliminate having to use double pointed needles, so we don't have to worry about that either. So we're going to go ahead and join to work in the round, and as you can see, my cast on edge is on the same side of the needle all the way around. We don't want it twisted so that it's partway on the other side of the needle. We want it to stay on the inside edge all the way around our needle here. So I'm going to pick up the working yarn, and what we're going to do first is we're going to place a stitch marker on the right needle to mark the beginning of the round. So here are my stitch markers for this project, and the one that I'm using for the beginning of the round is a very different looking marker from the ones I'm going to be using to mark the raglan lines, because these we want to kind of all be the same, but we want the end of round marker to stand out, and we know for sure that that's the end of round marker because it's a totally different kind of marker or a totally different color, whatever you want to do. Just make sure that your end of round marker looks different from the other ones that you're going to use for the raglan lines. So I'm going to go ahead and place that end of round marker around my right needle, and that is going to hang there and sit on the needle in between the first and the last stitch of the round as we are knitting, but it never gets clipped into the fabric. So we're just going to be sliding it onto the tip of the right needle every time we finish a round. So let's go ahead and start round 1, and for round 1 to 5 we're going to knit 2, purl 2, all the way around, and we're going to repeat that until we get back to the marker. Now as you do this very first round, it is going to be a little more difficult to work into because it's the cast on. And cast on rows, the very first row, is generally slightly more difficult, but as long as you haven't done it too tight, it shouldn't be hard to work into as far as having to force your stitches on the needle. It's just a little bit different, you know, working into that first round. So we're just going to do this knit 2, purl 2 sequence all the way around till we get back to the marker. And I'm just going to stop right here at the magic loop to show you how we treat that as we move on to the next part of the round. Alright, so I've got a knit 2 left on this needle, and then we have all this extra length left. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back over here and pull on the length of the cable, and then we're going to come to the right needle and pull on it and take the length that was left over on this side, and we're basically sliding it down to the right side. And then we're going to loop the needle so that that extra cable length is kind of wrapped around my hand and it's held out of the way. So now I can continue knitting around. The last 2 stitches I did was a knit 2, so I'm going to do a purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, and I can keep going around, making sure that as I make my way around, I'm just kind of pulling the slack from this side of the needle into the loop. So I'm going to keep going till I get to the end of the round where my marker is, and then we will move on to the next round. Alright, so I'm down to my last couple of stitches here. I've made it to the marker. All that's left on my left needle is the marker before the next stitch of the next round. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tip of my right needle and pick up that marker and slide it over. So every time we get to the end of the round, we're going to do that. We're going to slip the marker from the left needle to the right needle, and that way we know that we are now beginning another round. So in the instructions, as I mentioned, the knit 2, purl 2 is for rounds 1 to 5. So that was round 1, and we're going to continue doing that up to round 5. So I'm going to repeat that round 4 more times to get to the end of round 5 with just that knit 2, purl 2 all the way around. And of course, when we get to the loop, in the magic loop, we will resituate the stitches as before to get the extra slack in the loop to the other end of the needle and loop it around. So I'm going to continue with these knit 2, purl 2 rounds until I have made it to the end of round 5. Alright, so I've finished knitting rounds 1 to 5, and that is the end of our ribbing for now. We're going to add some more ribbing later on in the sweater, but for the neckline ribbing, that is it. And what we're going to do now is for round 6, we're going to knit all the way around, and we're going to be placing stitch markers to show us where the raglan increases are going to go. So as I go through this round, just keep in mind that the numbers of stitches that we're going to be doing in between the markers here are going to be different for every size. So I'm just going to do what the number of stitches is for my size, but whatever size that you're making, just check the pattern to see how many stitches you should work in between each of these markers. So I'm going to start by knitting 11. All right, and then I'm going to place a marker on my needle. So that is going to be the first half of the back of the sweater, because this end of round marker is going to mark the center back. So we're dividing the back part of the sweater in half with that end of round marker. So we've knit across the first half of the stitches for the back. Then we've placed our marker. And now for the sleeve, we're going to knit 10 and place another marker. And those are the stitches for the sleeve right here. So for the size that I'm making, I'm now going to knit 22. And in between my 22, I'm going to have to rearrange my stitches on the needle to keep going around. So I just did 9, and I'm going to continue to finish out the rest of those 22. All right, now I've knit across 22 stitches from here to here, and I'm going to place another marker. And those are the stitches for the front of our sweater. And now I'm going to knit 10 for the other sleeve and place another marker. And then I'm just going to knit to the end of the round where my stitch marker is dangling. And for the size that I'm making, that's another 11 stitches. All right, so now I can slip the marker, and that is the end of round 6. So now we have all these stitch markers here. We can see that the smaller spaces between the green stitch markers are the sleeves here, and then this section is the front of the sweater, and then the other longer section with the end of round marker in the middle of it is the back of our sweater. So now we're going to begin increasing for the raglan shaping while we work the stitch pattern for the sweater, and this is not a difficult stitch pattern to work. So we're going to move into these increase rounds, and for increase round number 1, we are going to knit every stitch until we have 1 stitch left before the marker. All right, so I've got 1 stitch left before my marker, and what we're going to do is we're going to work a right lifted increase into this stitch. Now, if you're not familiar with lifted increases, I do have a video on this that will show these increases in more detail. But for now, I'm just going to demonstrate it quickly a few times as we go around this round. But go ahead and go check out the lifted increases video for more information. So instead of knitting into the stitch that's on my needle, I'm going to come down here and pick up the right leg, which is the right side of the loop of the stitch below the one on my needle. So here's the one on the needle. I'm going to come down here and pick up the right side or the right leg of the stitch below it, put it up on the needle, knit through it, and then knit through the stitch that was already on the needle. So that is a right lifted increase, and that gives us another stitch to the right of the stitch that was already there. So now I'm going to slip the marker to the right needle and work a left lifted increase, which is going to go in this very first stitch after the marker. So for the left lifted increase, I'm going to knit the next stitch. Then I'm going to take my left needle and pick up the left side of the stitch 2 rows below the one on my needle. So right here, the stitch that is below the one on the right needle, so this stitch right here, that was the stitch that was just on my left needle. So we're going to the stitch below that, and the reason that it seems different that way is because we've already knit into the top of the stitch that was already there, whereas with the right lifted increase, we knitted into the top of it after we picked up from the stitch below. So now I've picked up the left side of the loop, or the left leg, of the stitch 2 rows below the one on my needle, and it's sitting on my left needle like so, and I'm going to knit into that stitch. So that's the left lifted increase. So I'm going to repeat that little sequence we just did 3 more times. So I'm going to knit till I've got 1 stitch before my marker, and I'm going to work that right lifted increase into that very first stitch before the marker. So I'm going to pick up the stitch below, put it up on the needle and knit through it, and then knit through the stitch that was already there. That's my right lifted increase. Then I'm going to slip the marker and work the left lifted increase. So I'm going to knit through the stitch on the needle, pick up the stitch 2 rows below, and knit into that. And that is 1 repeat. So we're going to do that 2 more times now, once till we get to the increase right after this marker, and then once more till we get to the increase right after this marker. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll show you how to finish the round. Alright, so we've just finished that last left lifted increase, and there are no more green markers left. All that's left is the end of round marker. So I'm going to go ahead and knit to my end of round marker. Then I'll slip the end of round marker, and that is the end of our first increase round. So for round 2, we're not going to be increasing on round 2, but we're going to be adding the dots in the dot stitch on round 2. And so for round 2, I'm going to purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1 to the marker. So purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, and then I'm going to slip my marker and knit 2. So again, I'm going to purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1 until I get to the marker. Then I'm going to slip the marker and knit 2. So I'm going to keep repeating that until I get to the last marker, and I do that after the last marker. Alright, so that's the last green marker. I've slipped it, and then I'm going to knit 2. And that's the last repeat of that because we're almost back to the end of round marker. So now I'm just going to purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1 until I get back to the marker. Alright, so we're back to the marker, and my marker has kind of come unclipped and gotten caught around the edge of a piece of yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up just because that's what type of marker it is. This kind opens, but if you're just using the ring type like we've got here that does not open, then that won't happen. It will just slip to the needle. Alright, so those are the 2 kind of setup rounds for our increases, and that just gets us through a half a repeat before we start working full repeats of our set of increase rounds. So now we're going to move on to round 3, and round 3 is just like round 1. And each time we work a round 1 or a round 3 or even a round 5, which is the ones that they're all the exact same round, we're going to be increasing 8 stitches in that round. So when you go to count your stitches at the end of the round, you want to make sure you have 8 more than you did on the previous round. But we're only increasing stitches every other round and not every single round because that would make it get wider too fast. So for round 3, I'm going to knit till I've got 1 stitch before my marker, and then I'm going to work that right lifted increase, slip the marker, and work the left lifted increase. So again, I'm going to knit till I've got 1 stitch before my marker, work the right lifted increase, slip the marker, and work the left lifted increase. So I'm going to keep doing that until I have done it on both sides of the last green marker, which is over here. Alright, so now we've increased on both sides of the last green marker, and we're going to knit to the end. Alright, we made it to the end, and we're going to slip the marker at the end of the round. So for round 4, we're going to be adding more dots in our dot stitch. And for round 4, we're going to knit 1, purl 1, until we have 1 stitch before the marker. So knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, till we have 1 stitch left before our stitch marker. Then we're going to knit that stitch, slip the marker, knit the next stitch, and then we're going to repeat that sequence that we just worked 3 more times. So we're going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, till we get to 1 stitch before the next marker. There we are. We're going to knit that 1 stitch, slip the marker, and knit 1 more stitch. So again, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 till we get to 1 stitch before the next marker. Alright, then we're going to knit the stitch before the marker, slip the marker, and knit the next stitch. So I'm going to keep repeating that until I have got past the next marker. So now I've got past the last green marker in my round, and I'm going to go ahead and knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, all the way to the end of round marker. All right, so there we are. And that is the end of round 4. So for round 5, we're going to increase stitches again. And round 5 is exactly the same as round 3. So I'm just going to go ahead and work round 5 off camera because I've already basically demonstrated it, having already shown you round 3. All right, so here's my end of round marker, and I'll just slip the end of round marker. So now let's move on to round 6. And for round 6, we are going to purl one, knit one to the marker. So purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one till we get to the marker, the green one. All right, we're going to slip the marker, and then we're going to knit 2. So we're going to repeat that again. We're going to purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one till we get to the marker. Then we're going to go ahead and slip the marker and knit 2. So I'm going to keep repeating that until I have worked just past that last green marker of the round. All right, so that is the last time we repeat that because we've just worked the last 2 stitches on the other side of the last green marker. So now we're going to purl one, knit one to the end. All right, there's the end of round marker, and we're going to slip it. Now, one thing that you'll notice at this point is that I've run out of room on my needle to have that magic loop sticking out because now I have enough stitches, since we've increased a bunch of stitches over the last few rounds, that my stitches will fill up the entire needle without having to have the excess stitches, or the excess cable length I should say, pulled and looped out of the way. So now I can just knit on this circular needle as normal without the loop. And you will also notice that as we continue to increase and make this larger, the stitches will actually be bunched on the needle because there will be more stitches on the needle than just what can sit here flat. So as we continue, it will start bunching more, and you'll have like lots and lots of stitches on the length of your needle. And that's what's supposed to happen, so don't worry about that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to repeat rounds 3 to 6 several more times to finish the increases for the raglan part of the sweater. So for the size that I'm making, which is the extra small, I need to repeat rounds 3 to 6 4 more times. So that will give me the correct number of stitches and the correct length that I need for the size that I'm making. Now, one thing I do want to point out here. At this point, the neckline of this sweater looks really small. But that is the ribbing contracting up. This is not a tight neckline at all. And in fact, the ribbing actually kind of goes straight up because it's just the way that it lays that makes it lay smooth and round like this. But this ribbing has a lot of room in it. It's plenty of room to get it over your head. So if it looks really small right now, don't worry because it's not as small as it looks when it's laying flat. When it's flat, it looks about the size of my hand, and I have relatively small hands. But this has plenty of room in it because of that ribbing. The ribbing is just contracting and kind of being elastic like it is, but it's a very gentle elasticity. So don't worry about this being too tight around the neck because it is not. It is very stretchy and roomy, and there's plenty of room to put this over the head. So I'm going to go ahead and continue repeating rounds 3 to 6 until I've done it the correct number of times for the size that I'm making. Alright, so I finished repeating those increase rounds for our raglan shaping. And now as you can see, I have too many stitches on my needle for it to lay flat. That's not a problem because as long as they can all sit on the needle comfortably without falling off, that's fine. But now we're going to, since we've finished all the raglan increases, we're going to separate the stitches for the front and back from the stitches for the sleeves. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the stitches for the sleeves, which is in these shorter sections between these 2 markers and these 2 markers. We're going to put those sections of stitches onto a piece of waste yarn to hold them so we can pick them up and work them later. So for the first round of the body of the sweater, we are going to knit until we reach that first marker. All right, there we go. We are to the first marker. What we're going to do now is we're going to remove the marker, and we are going to pick up our length of waste yarn. I have a yarn needle with the waste yarn threaded through it, and we're just going to slip all the stitches up to the next marker onto this waste yarn. Now the pattern does tell you the exact number of stitches that you're going to be slipping onto the waste yarn. For the size that I'm making, it's 32 stitches, but it will be different depending on which size you're making. So I'm basically just inserting my yarn needle as if to purl into all of these stitches to slide them onto the waste yarn, and that will help hold them later so we can come back when we're finished with the body and pick up the stitches to knit the sleeves. So I'm just going to slip all the stitches to the next marker, and then we're going to connect the stitches for the front to the stitches for the back. Alright, so that was the last stitch before the second marker. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my yarn needle out. I'm going to remove the second marker from the needle, and we now have all the stitches for the sleeve strung onto this piece of waste yarn. So now we have one more problem, and that is that we need to keep knitting across this next needle, except the yarn is over here. And another thing that we need to fix here is that we want to connect the stitches from the front and the back together at the underarm. So what we're going to do is we're going to cast on a few stitches at the underarm before we start knitting across the rest of what's on the needle. So for all sizes, we're going to cast on 4 stitches, and we're going to use the E-wrap cast on. So I'm going to pick up the yarn in my hand like this with my thumb behind and then to the front of the yarn, so that the working yarn is going behind my thumb, then in front of it, and down through my hand. So to cast on 4 E-wrap stitches, I'm going to pick up the strand of yarn that's on the front of my thumb, lift that whole loop off of my thumb. We're just basically putting a twisted loop on the needle, and then pull it, not tight, but just snug so that it's not, flopping around and loose. We want it to sit against the needle closely, but not so that it's too tight. So that's one stitch. So again, I'm going to grab the yarn and pick it up with my thumb like this, and then slide that loop that was around my thumb onto the needle. That's the second stitch. We'll do it again for a third stitch and a fourth stitch. All right, so now we have 4 stitches cast on between the back stitches, since we're starting at the back where the end of round marker is. This is the first half of the back stitches. Now we've cast on for the underarm, and now we can continue knitting across what's left on the other side of the needle. And the reason we're adding these stitches here is because this is going to help improve the fit. If we were to just pinch that together right there and not cast on any extra stitches at the underarm, not only would the sleeve be too small, because this the sleeve number of stitches is calculated for having that extra bit of stitches at the underarm, but this would also be less comfortable if the sleeve stitches just kind of pinched together at the very bottom and didn't have any armhole stitches at the underarm to separate a little bit. All right, so we have slipped all of the stitches for the first sleeve onto waste yarn, and we've cast on 4 stitches for the underarm. At this point, I like to take the waste yarn and just tie it together in a loose knot, just to make sure that there's no way that the waste yarn can come out of those stitches while we're knitting the rest of the sweater. So now I'm going to go ahead and knit across the stitches on the left needle until I come to the third marker. Alright, so we are to that third green marker, and the stitches between these next 2 markers is the stitches for the other sleeve. So we're going to do the same thing again. I'm going to remove the marker, slip all these stitches between this marker and the next marker onto another length of waste yarn, and then I'm going to cast on 4 stitches for the underarm, and then we will go ahead and knit across the rest of this round. So I'm going to go ahead and put all these stitches on waste yarn, and cast on the 4 stitches for the underarm, and then I will show you what it looks like and what we're going to do for the rest of the round. Alright, so I've done the same thing here as I did on the other sleeve. I've got all my sleeve stitches on the waist yarn, and I've cast on 4 more at the underarm. So now we're just going to knit across until we get to that end of round marker. Alright, so we're to the end of the round. We're going to slip the marker, and now we can move on to the rest of the body of the sweater. So we're going to keep knitting basically a tube straight without any shaping to make the body of the sweater longer. I'm going to go ahead and knit 1 more stitch just to hold the marker on, but I'm going to undo that before I start the next round so that I can show you what this now looks like. So if we turn this right side up, here is our neck edge. Here's my cast on tail. And now we have split our stitches so that these are for the sleeve here. And of course the sleeve looks kind of narrow right now, but for one thing this is the smallest size, but for another thing you're also not seeing the extra sleeve circumference that's added by those 4 cast on stitches. So it is actually a little bigger around than it looks when it's laying flat once we have knit the rest of the body of the sweater. So you can kind of see how our sweater is taking shape. And now we're going to go ahead and just knit straight down from here in the round to finish the length of the body of the sweater. Alright, so now we can move on to the rest of the body of the sweater. And what we did when we knit around and split the sleeve stitches from the body stitches, that was round 1. So now we're going to go ahead and work round 2. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of or undo that stitch that I knit just to hold the marker on. So for round 2, we are going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way around until we get back to the beginning of round marker. And we don't have any other stitch markers on here right now. So everything that we do in reference to a marker is just to the beginning of round marker. So I'm going to keep repeating that knit 1, purl 1 all the way around until I get back to the marker. Alright, so I'm coming up to these cast on stitches, and the last stitch from the body of the sweater was a purl, so I purled it. And what we've got here is when you work stitches, when you cast on stitches with an E-wrap like we did here, any slack that's in that yarn, which needs to be there so that they're not too tight, tends to try to work itself into one spot. So as we knit across these 4 stitches, of course we're going to be knitting and purling, but as we go across these, we are going to try to be careful not to pull on any one stitch too hard so that we don't get one stitch, get all the slack in that one stitch and make it really loose. So we're still going to insert the same way that we normally insert into a stitch, to knit and to purl. And I tend to go very slowly and use a slightly different method of wrapping my stitches, going around that that E-wrap little section right there, just because I don't want to stretch any of my stitches too much. But that's not how I would normally, I don't normally go like this to wrap my purls. Anyway, that will help keep the E-wrap stitches from getting the slack in that yarn all in one spot if we work through them very carefully. And another thing is that once we go ahead and pick up the sleeve stitches to knit the sleeves, we're going to pick up some stitches along the edge of this E-wrap cast on. So you don't have to worry about it being perfectly even, because we are going to pick up stitches from that later, and it will help neaten it up a little bit. So I'm going to continue around with my knit 1, purl 1 sequence until I get back to the marker as I mentioned before. Alright, so I'm back to my marker, and we're going to slip the marker, and that's the end of round 2. So now we're going to move on to round 3, and for round 3 we are going to just knit every stitch around till we get back to the marker. Alright, so I'm back to my marker. We're going to slip the marker. That's the end of round 3. And now we're going to move on to round 4. And for round 4, we're going to purl 1, knit 1 around. So purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, all the way back around to the marker. Alright, I'm back to the marker again. So that is the end of round 4. And for round 5, we're just going to repeat round 3, which is to knit every stitch all the way around. Alright, so that's the end of round 5, and I've slipped my marker. So now what we're going to do is we're going to repeat rounds 2 to 5, and we're going to continue repeating those 4 rounds until our sweater is the length that we need it to be from the cast on edge down here to the base of the stitches on the needles. And we're going to add more length to the sweater after that in the form of some ribbing, but we're going to continue in the dot stitch pattern until our sweater is a certain length from the cast on edge. So for the size that I'm making, I need to repeat rounds 2 to 5 until my piece is approximately 18.5 inches from the cast on to right about here, the base of the stitches that are on my needle. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to repeat rounds 2 to 5 until my sweater is the correct length for the size that I'm making, and then we'll move on to the ribbing. So now I have continued working the body of the sweater until it is the length measurement that I need it to be for the size that I'm making, and that is measured from this cast on edge right here to the stitches that are currently on the needle. So now that the body of my sweater is the correct length that it should be at this point, now we can move on to the ribbing. So we're going to work 10 rounds of knit 2, purl 2 ribbing at the bottom edge of our sweater. So for the next 10 rounds, I'm just going to knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, all the way around till I get back to the marker. So I'm going to do that for 10 rounds, and that will create our ribbing. And it will look very similar to the ribbing that we have around the neck edge, only it will be quite a bit wider this way than this ribbing. This is a more narrow ribbing. At the bottom edge of our sweater, we're going to do a wider ribbing. So we're just going to continue to knit 2, purl 2, all the way around till we get back to the marker for 10 rounds. Alright, so I finished my ribbing section. I've done 10 rounds of that ribbing, and now what we're going to do is bind off. Now I know some people tend to bind off rather tightly, but we're going to make a conscious effort to make sure that all of our bind off stitches are pretty loose so that our bind off edge has some give in it and has enough stretch in it to be comfortable on the body. So what we're going to do is, since I just finished my last round, I'm going to take off my marker, and then we are going to start binding off. So what we're going to do is we're going to knit the first stitch, and then knit the second stitch, and then we're going to take the first stitch that we knit, lift it up over the top of the second stitch and of the needle tip, stretch it out really good, and then let go of it. So how tight our bind off stitches are is dependent on how tight we make the actual stitches. So we're going to leave the stitches kind of loose. You can see how normally my stitch would be sitting right about here, but I'm going to get some stretch into it and kind of loosen up the stitch before I go ahead and do the next stitch. So I've got a loose stitch here. The next stitch in my round is a purl stitch, as you can see by the purl column. So I'm going to purl that next stitch, leave it kind of loose and stretched out like that. Then we're going to pick up the first stitch and pass it over the second one. And again, I want to make sure that the stitch on my needle is still loose on the needle. We want it to be, you know, kind of bigger around than what the needle is. So my next stitch is a purl. I just split the yarn right there, so let me resituate that. And again, I want to stretch the loop on the needle so that it's much bigger than normal. And then we'll pass the first stitch over the second one. So stretch out the stitch. The next one is a knit column, so I'm going to knit the next stitch, leave it loose on my needle, stretched out, pass the first stitch over the second one. Then here's the next knit stitch right here. This is the other part of my knit column. I'm going to knit that stitch loosely, leave the stitch stretched out, and pass the first stitch over the second one. And by the way, when you leave your stitches very loose like this, as you're binding off, that also helps make it easier to pass the stitches over the next stitch And that way it makes it a little easier not to bind off so tightly, because a lot of times what people do when they bind off tightly is they pull. They either pull on their yarn or they are having to pull to get tight stitches over the tip of the needle, and then that pulls on the previous stitch, making the previous stitch tighter, and we don't want to do that. So by making our stitches very loose and stretched out, it makes it not only easier to bind off, but it also leaves us a loose, stretchy edge so that when we're wearing the garment, it won't be limiting the amount of stretch in that bottom edge. So I'm going to continue binding off in pattern, which means I'm going to be knitting the knit stitches and purling the purl stitches until I get back to the beginning of my round. Alright, there's my last bind off stitch. So now I'm going to leave a 6 to 8 inch tail, cut my yarn, and I'm going to go ahead and lift up on the loop that's on my needle until the tail comes out. So to finish this off, you can see right here this looks kind of sloppy. We're going to grab a yarn needle, and I'm going to feed the yarn tail into my yarn needle. And what we're going to do is we're going to come and recreate the top of a bind off stitch to close up this little gap. So if you look right here, if we look at this bind off stitch, the yarn comes like this across the front, through the next stitch, and then back down over here and down through the center of the previous stitch. So our yarn is coming out of what's going to be the previous stitch. I'm going to come over here and pick up both the front strand and the back strand of the very first bound off stitch, and I'm going to insert my needle into that from front to back, like so. And I'm going to leave some length in that because I don't want to be closing up a gap like this. I want to kind of leave what looks like a stitch in between there, like that. So what we're going to do is, now that we have brought the yarn through this way, we need to bring it back down like this to finish that, mimicked bound off stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and insert my needle down through the previous stitch, right where my yarn was originally coming from, to finish up that imaginary bound off stitch right there. So right now I'm going to go ahead and bring my yarn to the back because I'm going to weave in that tail in a little bit. But first I just want to show you how stretchy our edge is now. So that bind off edge, because we did it so loosely, is not going to limit the stretch of our hem of our sweater. Alright, so now here's what our sweater looks like. Here's the top of the sweater, and then here is the ribbing at the bottom. So now we're going to come over here and start working on one of these sleeves. So the first step is to untie the waste yarn that is holding these sleeve stitches that we picked up onto waste yarn earlier. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our needle, and by the way, we're using a circular needle that is much longer than the actual circumference of the sleeve, and this is the same one we used for the body. I'll show you how to deal with that in just a minute. But what we're going to do first is we're going to start going in a clockwise direction. We're going to start picking up the stitches that are on the waste yarn and slipping them onto the needle. So I'm going to start at this end, and I'm just going to slip the stitches onto my needle, just as if I were going to insert into the stitch as if to purl. Then once they're on the needle, I can start taking the waste yarn out of those stitches and just pick up a few at a time. We're just sliding them onto the needle again, and we're not twisting them, we're not resituating them, we're just slipping them back on in the same direction that they're already facing. And I'm going to do this all the way around until I get all of the stitches from this sleeve back on the needles. Alright, so here is my last little stitch, and it looks a little tight just because of the angle at which it is pulled by sitting on the waste yarn. So I'm going to take the waste yarn and just kind of tug on it a little bit to bring some slack back into that stitch. So now I can pull out the waste yarn completely. And then here is what our sleeve looks like at this point. So this right here is where we cast on stitches at the underarm. And these are the stitches that we had left over from the sleeve when we knit the top part of the sweater. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up stitches at this underarm edge with our working yarn. And what we need to do is we're going to kind of pull on the right needle until the left needle slides back into the stitches on the left side. And the way we're going to go about this is because our circular needle is so much longer than the actual sleeve circumference, we're going to be looping the extra length in the cable out of the way. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to this underarm edge, and we're going to find about where the center is. And I'm going to say the center is right about there. And starting just on one side of the center, I'm going to start just to the left of the center and start picking up stitches on this underarm edge. So I'm going to pick up 3 stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first one where I just inserted my needle. Then here's the second one, which is in the base of the cast on stitches that we cast on at the underarm. And then the next stitch that I pick up, the third stitch, is going to be kind of in between the cast on stitches and the stitches on the needle. And that's because since we're changing the direction that we're knitting here, the knitting is kind of pulled right here at the corner. Because here is basically a corner where 2 directions of stitches are coming together. And what we need to do is pick up our third stitch in that gap between the cast on stitches and the stitches on the needle, and that will help close the gap, and we're going to go ahead and decrease those stitches out later. So what we're going to do is, now that we've picked up 3 stitches at the underarm, starting from the center and moving to the one side, we're going to knit all the stitches all the way across our needle until we get to the other side of the underarm gap. And as we work with this magic loop method, especially as we start decreasing the sleeve and making it smaller, you might want to just pull some extra cable length into another loop about halfway through the round, just to make sure that you have enough room to move your needles around. Because as you can see, if my needle was still going this direction, this would be harder to knit around because I'm dealing with a small circumference. So I'm going to go ahead and pull a second loop of cable into my magic loop to make sure that I have enough room to maneuver my needles. So as I mentioned, I'm going to keep knitting around till I get back to the other side of the underarm gap. But when I get to the loop in a magic loop, I'm going to go ahead and knit the last stitch off the needle before the loop. Then I can go ahead and pull on the other side of the loop and bring the needle back into those stitches. So I brought the left needle into the stitches that were on the other side of my loop. And then when I go ahead and pull the right needle out, I'm going to pull some slack in the cable and then loop it around my hand as I start knitting to loop the extra length out of the way. Alright, so that was the last stitch that was sitting on my left needle. I'm again going to pull the slack of the loop into that kind of halfway through the round loop. And now we're back to this gap between the center of the underarm edge where I first picked up those 3 stitches right here. We still have a gap left because we started at the center of the underarm and not at one side. We want our end of round to be at the center of the underarm. So here's the underarm edge. I've picked up 3 stitches from the center to going towards this side. We've knit around. Now we're going to pick up 3 more stitches as we come back to the center of the underarm edge. So I'm going to pick up my first stitch in that corner area between the stitch that was on my needle already and the underarm edge. And then I can pick up the last 2 of those 3 stitches in the underarm edge. And we're basically going into the back of the cast on, the other side of what we cast on initially. Alright, so we're back to the beginning of the round. That was the end of round 1. We're going to weave in this tail later. And I'm going to grab my end of round marker and put it on the needle. So as we can see here, my magic loop that's sticking out over here is kind of not in the center. It doesn't have to be perfectly in the center, but it's just a little easier to maneuver if it is relatively centered. So I've moved my loop length kind of to the halfway point of my round. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull on my right needle to bring some slack into my loop on this side. So now we are ready to knit round 2, again with that magic loop method. And for round 2, we're going to knit the first stitch, and it's going to be kind of loose because that's our first picked up stitch, so you're just going to tug on the tail. So we've knit our first stitch, And then we're going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way around until we get to 1 stitch before our marker. Alright, I've got 1 stitch before my marker, and I'm going to knit that last stitch. So now I can slip my marker, and then we're going to resituate our magic loop again. We're going to pull the slack in the loop that's left to bring the left needle back into those stitches, and then pull the right needle tip out to create another loop on this side at the beginning of our round. So we're going to tuck that little tail out of the way, weave it in later, and I'm going to bring my working yarn around so that it is in the correct position for knitting. And now we're going to move on to round 3. So for round 3, we're going to go ahead and decrease out that extra stitch that we picked up on each side of the underarm edge for the corner, because if we didn't pick up a stitch there, we'd end up with a hole in between where those stitches are coming from different directions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and knit the first stitch, and then I'm going to do a decrease called knit 2 together. If you're familiar with increases and decreases, this is probably the one that you know. But for a knit 2 together, we're just going to make a knit stitch that goes into 2 stitches at the same time. So instead of inserting my needle into 1 stitch as if to knit and then knitting through it, I'm going to insert my needle into the next 2 stitches as if to knit, and then knit through both of them at the same time. That's a knit 2 together. So we're going to be using that more, and I will show that again in the next batch of rounds that we're going to be using that for. So now we're going to knit around until we have 3 stitches left before the marker. Alright, we've got 3 stitches left before our marker, which is dangling over here. And we're going to work an SSK. And SSK stands for slip, slip, knit, and it is another way of decreasing a stitch. So when we decrease a stitch, we're making 2 stitches into 1, and an SSK does the exact same thing as a knit 2 together, except it's a reverse. It's a mirror image of a knit 2 together. Whereas a knit 2 together, we are making the stitch that is on the left go on top of the stitch on the right. With an SSK, we're taking the stitch on the right and putting it on top of the stitch on the left. So for an SSK, we're going to slip 1 as if to knit, slip 1 as if to knit, that's the SS. And then for the K, we're going to take those 2 stitches we just slipped, poke the left needle back through both of them, so that the left needle is going through the front of both of those stitches, and then we will knit them together, like so. So I will demonstrate that again the next time we use it, but we've got 1 stitch left on the needle, and we're going to knit that stitch. Alright, so now we can slip our marker and move on to the next round, which is round 4. Alright, so for round 4, we're just going to purl 1, knit 1 around until we get back to the marker. Alright, so we're back to the marker. We can go ahead and slip our marker to the right needle. We're going to go ahead and resituate our magic loop. And now for the size that I'm making, we're going to do rounds 5 to 8. Now, because of some of the larger sizes having a lot more stitches in the sleeve circumference at this point, and we need to get rid of more stitches on the larger sizes, some of the larger sizes are going to skip this section, which is a section with no decreases in it, and they're going to move on straight to the decrease portions of the sleeve. Now, for the size that I'm making, which is the extra small, there aren't as many stitches in the sleeve at this point, and we don't need to get rid of as many stitches to get down to the cuff. So what we're going to do is for the extra small and for a couple of the other sizes, we're going to knit a little bit of a straight section with no decreases in it before we move on to the decrease section. So this is why it's important to pay attention to the instructions in the written pattern so that you know exactly what to do for the size that you're making. But for the size that I'm making, I'm going to go ahead and work rounds 5 to 8, which is our little straight section before we begin decreasing. So for round 5, I'm going to knit every stitch around. Alright, there's the end of my round 5. Now we're going to slip the marker and resituate the magic loop again. And now we can move on to round 6. And for round 6, I'm going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way around. Alright, I'm back to the end of my round. We're going to go ahead and slip the marker and move on to round 7. So for round 7, I'm going to repeat round 5, and I'm going to knit every stitch around. Alright, there's the end of round 7. We're going to go ahead and move on to round 8. And for round 8, we're going to purl 1, knit 1 around. Alright, so that's the end of round 8. So most sizes are not going to use any of rounds 5 to 8 at all, but for the sizes that do, you may need to repeat them depending on the size that you're making. So for the size that I'm making, which is the extra small, I'm going to repeat rounds 5 to 8 3 more times and then move on to the decrease section. However, not every size that uses that section of rounds is going to need to repeat it again. So just again, follow the instructions for the size that you're making. I'm going to go ahead and repeat rounds 5 to 8 3 more times for my size, and then I will show you how we are going to go through the decrease sections. Alright, so I've finished repeating rounds 5 to 8, and here's what my sleeve looks like at this point. It's basically kind of a straight extension of where we already were. But what we're going to do now is move on to the decrease section. Now, like I said, some of the other sizes skip this part that we just did with rounds 5 to 8 and move straight to the decrease section without this little straight part in between. So for the decrease section, I'm going to demonstrate the first few rounds because the decrease section is divided into 3 parts. So there's decrease section 1, decrease section 2, and decrease section 3. So as we move through these sections, some of the sizes are going to work some sections, some sizes are only going to work other sections, and it depends on which size that you're making, which sections you're going to work and how many times you'll repeat each one. Now, for the size that I'm making, which is the extra small, I only need to work decrease section 1, and then I need to work that several times, and that will get me to the full length of my sleeve and get the cuff stitches decreased down to the right number for the cuff. However, some of the other sizes do not work decrease section 1 very many times, and then they move on to decrease section 2 and 3, which basically each section is a set of rounds where that the rounds with the decrease are closer and closer together. So for decrease section 1, the decrease rounds are spaced with 8 rounds in between each decrease, whereas in section 2 they're spaced 4 rounds apart, and section 3 they're spaced 2 rounds apart, or every other round. So for the sizes that require getting rid of more stitches to bring the cuff down to the right number of stitches, those sizes are going to do less of decrease section 1 and more of decrease sections 2 and 3. So for the size that I'm making, which is the extra small, I'm only going to be doing decrease section 1, and I'm going to repeat that a bunch of times until I get to the full length of my sleeve and get the cuff stitches to where they should be. But basically the techniques are the same for all the decrease sections. So no matter which size you're making, the techniques that I'm going to show in the first couple rounds that I'm going to demonstrate on video are going to apply to all the different decrease sections. So again, just pay attention to the numbers and the instructions for the size that you're making, and refer to the video for the actual technique and the visual demonstration of the stitches. So really all that you're going to see in this part, besides what we've already been doing, is the actual decreases themselves. So in decrease section 1, I'm only going to show you rounds 9, 10, 11, and 12, but there are more rounds, and all of the rounds are very similar. It's basically the same stitch pattern we've been doing, but we're going to be getting rid of a stitch at the beginning and at the end of one round every so many rounds. And the pattern does spell out exactly what you need to do that for whatever size that you're making. So for round 9, I'm going to start with a knit 2 together. And as we mentioned before, knit 2 together is just like a regular knit stitch, only we're inserting the right needle into 2 stitches at the same time as if to knit, like so. And then we're going to knit through both of them at the same time and let both of them slip off the left needle at the same time. So that's a knit 2 together. And if you want to see how to do that again, feel free to rewind the video and watch that little section again. So for the rest of round 9, I'm going to knit around until I have 2 stitches left in my round. Alright, so there's 2 stitches left in my round, and we're going to do that SSK right here. And again, SSK is slip, slip, knit. So we're going to slip 1 stitch as if to knit, so we're just inserting the needle into the stitch as if to knit, but not knitting it. We're just sliding it over to the right needle. Then we're going to slip the 2nd stitch as if to knit, and that is the SS, or slip, slip. And then we're going to take the left needle and insert it from left to right through the front of both of those stitches, like so. So we're making kind of an X with our needles, with the right needle in the back. And then we'll knit through both of those stitches at the same time. So that's the end of round 9. And now we can move on to round 10. So for round 10, we are going to purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, all the way around. Alright, so that's the end of round 10. And now we're going to do round 11. For round 11, we're going to knit every stitch around till we get back to the marker. Alright, and now for round 12, we're just going to knit 1, purl 1 around. Alright, and that's the end of round 12. Now, as I said, all of the rounds in all of the decrease sections are basically identical to one of the rounds I just showed you. It's just what makes the difference is how many times you work them and in what order. So the pattern spells all of that out, so you don't have to worry about trying to guess. So just follow the instructions for the size that you're making. But I'm going to go ahead and continue working through the decrease rounds for the size that I'm making, and then I'll show you how we're going to knit the cuff. Alright, so I've finished knitting the decrease part of my sleeve, and you can see it's kind of long now, and this is almost to the full length that it's going to be as a finished sleeve. So now we're going to work that cuff ribbing, and we're going to do that by working the first round, which is to knit all the way around, and we're doing that to kind of separate the dot stitch from the ribbing. So by having that single knit round in between, then that makes a kind of like a division between the purl bumps from the dot stitch and the purl bumps in the ribbing. Alright, so we've knit all the way around. And now we can move on to the actual ribbing part of the cuff. And if the cuff looks really small right now, it's because it is bunched up on the needles. But once this comes off the needles, it's going to be plenty of room for the wrist, and it's going to be relatively stretchy. Because, of course, this is knitted fabric. Knitting has quite a bit of stretch in it. So this is not going to be a tight-fitting cuff. Is it fitted? Yes, but not tight. Alright, so now for the ribbing rounds, we're going to do 7 rounds of knit 2, purl 2, all the way around. So just knit 2, purl 2, till we get back to the marker. And I'm going to go ahead and repeat that round 6 more times for a total of 7 rounds of that knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, and then I'll show you what we're going to do at the end. Alright, so that was the last round of ribbing, and now what we're going to do is we're going to finish this off with that very loose bind off that we used on the hem of the sweater. So again, we're going to knit the knit stitches and purl the purl stitches, but we're going to kind of keep those stitches very stretched so that they're not hugging the needle. We're going to keep them pretty loose, and that will help make sure that the edge of the cuff does not get too tight or limit the stretch. So I'm just going to go ahead and use that very loose bind off to finish off all the stitches in my round, and then we'll go ahead and tie off. Alright, there's the last stitch, and now we can go ahead and cut the yarn. We're going to stretch the loop on the needle until the tail comes out, and then we can go ahead and finish off our bind off edge with our yarn needle in the same manner that we did it on the hem. So we're just going to kind of recreate that little bound off stitch on the top edge of the work so that you can't really see where we started and stopped. Alright, so now I can go ahead and weave in my tail from the cuff. And you can see that this, because we did that stretchy bind off, that loose bind off, we have plenty of wiggle room and stretch room in the cuff. And it's a snug fitting cuff, but it's not a really tight cuff that you can't get your hand through. There's plenty of stretchy room in there. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and weave in the yarn tail for this sleeve. And then I'm going to come over here to the other side of the sweater and do the exact same instructions for the sleeve on this part of the sleeve, this other sleeve. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up all the stitches from this piece of waste yarn and knit the other sleeve just like the first one. Alright, so I have repeated the instructions on the other side of the sweater to make the second sleeve, and now both sleeves of my sweater are finished, all of my ends are woven in, and now it's time to block. So if you're not familiar with blocking, I do have a video on what blocking is, how to do it, and what type of blocking to use for whatever fiber content of the yarn you're using. So if you want more information on that, go click the link down below to learn how to block your finished piece. But I'm going to use steam blocking on my sweater because it is acrylic yarn in my project. So I'm going to go ahead and steam block my sweater just to kind of make the fabric look its best and lay its best, and then my sweater will be finished. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you make this project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.